can lead to much stronger relationships that produce better performance, not just for those individuals, but for the teams within which they work and the companies more broadly. And there are also discernible benefits to having diverse individuals in positions of leadership. So for example, Catalyst, a group that often examines the benefits and challenges to women in company settings, has found that in major companies, when there are 3 or more women who are on the board of leading companies, they experience an 84% higher return on their sales compared to companies when there aren't women on the board. Now, I think I have a poll question here just related to this out of curiosity for those who are playing along at home. I'm just curious to know whether in your company, are there 3 or more women in top leadership positions in your company or organization? I think there's a poll that we can see what the crowd says. And then I don't know if you, when we might be ready to close the poll. Does it look like we have enough responses? Oops.
Yes, we do. And it
there we go.
Like, yeah, can you see the results there, Tom?
Yeah, I see it now. Sorry, I had it shrunk. Yeah, so it looks like it's a fairly even split. So about 55% of people in the audience saying that yes, they do, and 45% saying no. So it'll be interesting to think about how you think of some of the topics and findings that I'll be talking about today reflect in your own company experience where you do or don't have a lot of female leadership. So moving along, let me get back over to my slide here. We often think about leadership positions and engineering and mining more specifically as being more masculine than feminine, or is associated with more men than women. The images I'm showing you here actually come from a basic Google image search. If you just type in business leader into Google image, you end up with pictures that look like this. And more specifically, if you type in engineer, this is a screen grab of what you find, and you'll notice a lot of similarities to the types of people that are often portrayed in roles in engineering or in positions of leadership. And what I'm going to be talking about today is how the ubiquitousness of seeing the same kinds of individuals in the same kinds of roles lead to kind of an imprinting on our minds of what those fields and roles are. In this case, that engineering is male. And if we look at the sciences and technology sectors across the years and the percentage of women who are in these occupations, you can see that there have been increases over the past 50, 60 years. Most notably, we see in the biological sciences that we're now at parity. But in fields like engineering and in computer science, that's where we're seeing the most underrepresentation. And at the beginning of the call, it was mentioned how in the mining sector in particular, that the percentage of women is still quite low. I think I have a poll question here just to have you think about your own experience. So thinking about the program where you got your highest level of education, yeah, so you were asked what percentage of women were in your degree program, so based on an estimate of your perceptions. And we're seeing the numbers come in that it's looking like about half of you are saying that it was probably in this under 30% range, which we would consider a very sort of underrepresentation of women in those fields. And then it's maybe split evenly between 30 and 50 and higher than 50%, with a few that are extremely low, below 10%. So if we think about this underrepresentation of women in these different fields, there's obviously lots of different factors that can play a role in women's underrepresentation in technology sectors. It can have to do with structural factors, economic factors, sociological factors. I'm going to set all of those aside for today, mainly because my expertise is in psychology. And so what I'm prepared to talk to you about are some of the psychological processes that can play a role in constraining women's advancement and inclusion. And apologies for that. It looks like it's cutting off a little bit on the slide. And so that's to say that this isn't the only factor that plays a role, but it's one of the ones that's often somewhat pernicious because it's not always as apparent to us. So to give a little background, I want to set the stage by talking about an idea that comes from Nobel Prize winning economist Danny Kahneman, who talks about how our cognitive system is set up to think in two different modes. On the one hand, we have the system 2 mode, which we might call the reflective system. This is what we use for controlled processing, for thinking through things deliberatively and weighing the costs and benefits. Right now, as you're listening to the information as part of this webcast, this is the mode of processing you're using. It's more effortful, it requires motivation, it takes time. It's why you can actually be mentally exhausted at the end of a day when you're not doing anything physically active. Now, fortunately, evolution has given us another system for processing information that we might call system 1 or the reflexive system that we use for more automatic processing. This is the system that relies on more implicit associations and well-learned procedures that allows us to do things on autopilot. It requires little effort, it functions very quickly and often outside of conscious awareness. If you've ever had the experience of driving home from work, intending to stop at the grocery store to pick up a few items and find yourself home in your driveway without ever having made that stop, you've realized how routines are often performing at this reflexive level. And it's kind of fascinating to think that you can, navigate a 2-ton vehicle down the road without necessarily consciously thinking about it all of the time. But that's some of the benefit of having this reflexive system. The problem, as we'll see, is that reflexive system can often be what we'll fall back on when we're perceiving people, and that can lead us to rely on biases. So when it comes to perceiving people, this reflexive system looks for patterns of covariation in our environment. It tries to learn the rules of what it should expect based on what it sees. And for people, that means we automatically come to assume that people are what we so often see them do. So when we're more likely to see women in roles that have to do with caring for others, the elderly, for children, teachers, nurses, we're more often to assume that women must have innately the traits and abilities that make them well suited for those roles, that they're caring, nurturing, and people-oriented. And by the same token, when we're more often likely to see men in positions that require technical skill or leadership positions, we're more often to draw, we are more likely to draw an assumption that men have mechanical skills and are task-oriented and are naturally born leaders. So these are some of the associations that we pick up. Now we might ask, what's the evidence that there are actual differences between men and women in these traits and abilities? And Janet Hyde in 2005 put together a summary of all the meta-analyses that had been done to that point, looking for differences, any evidence of differences between men and women in a variety of domains. And I'm just showing you a sampling of them here. So for example, it is the case that women are in studies shown to smile more readily than men. They're also shown to somewhat suffer from depression a little bit more than men. When we look at men, men are much more likely to throw things very fast compared to women. So, if you're looking to hire somebody who can throw things very fast, men are more likely on average to have that ability. But what I want to focus you to is these two domains in the middle, leadership and mathematical ability, because it pertains to some of the topics I'll be discussing here. And when we look on studies of leadership effectiveness, and we look at the studies on mathematical ability in kids and adults, we see very little difference between men and women in these skill sets. And yet we so often tend to assume or tend to see, like I showed you with those Google image searches at the beginning, that men are more likely to come up in leadership positions, that we're more likely to assume that science and technology and math fields are associated with men than with women. Now this is because, again, we have this reflexive system that relies on implicit associations. And implicit associations are the cognitive links that we have between concepts that co-vary. These implicit associations are completely distinct from our conscious intentions or beliefs. But when we see that there are more leaders who are men, we form a link between leader equals male more than female. This is reflected in some of our racial biases. And in fact, a lot of research in my field has looked at the way in which we develop implicit race biases. When the media presents us with many more images of criminals who are black than white, we form a link between black equals bad more than good. When we see that childcare is mostly done by women, we form a link of women equals family more than career. Now, how do we measure these implicit associations? I mean, as a scientist, I'm interested in how we can actually quantify what we mean by implicit bias and study its effects scientifically. And within the last couple of decades, researchers in my field have created a measure known as the implicit association test. Now, out of curiosity here, I think I have a poll. The next poll, I was curious whether or not any of you had previously heard about the implicit association test as a measure of implicit bias. Well, I'll just pause a little bit while numbers are coming in. Okay, so it looks like, again, things are pretty evenly split with about 40% saying that you have and 57% saying that you haven't. So I will talk a little bit about what this task is and describe it in a bit of detail. If we were in a face-to-face session, I would do more of an interactive demo with you, but it's a little hard in this webcast. But I have provided at the top of this slide a web link to an online resource through Harvard University where the developers of this task have created a site that you can go on to take the test, or some version of it really, because there are many different versions. Essentially what this is a cognitive task that is designed to measure the degree to which concepts that are cognitively linked are easier for people to group together. And as I said, there's been quite a bit of research done using this test to measure implicit racial bias. So the example I have here comes from that version of the task where people are shown either black or white faces, and they're having to make very quick categorizations at a computer screen between those faces, categorizing them as coming from a black individual or white individual, and then also categorizing words that are either positively or negatively valenced. So implicit racial bias makes it easier for people to categorize pictures of black men alongside negative words, and contrastingly, white men alongside positive words. Now, in our own research, we've used this same kind of task format to try to measure the degree to which people have an implicit engineering equals male association. And so the task, just to give you an idea of what it would look like if you were taking this as part of the study, you would be sitting at a computer screen like you are with these category labels at the top of the screen. So engineering on one side, family on the other side, male on one side, female on the other side. And then words come up on the center of the screen, and your task is to categorize. Is that, in this case, an engineering word or a family word? It's an engineering word, so you would respond with pushing a left button or using your left hand. If it's a female name, you would respond pressing the right button. Math, again, more engineering, so the left side. Ben is a male name. Parent is a family word. Male, or John is a male name. Children is associated with family. So again, we're just looking at semantic associations between, in this case, names and these other family or engineering related words. And this is one version, one set of trials where the task is designed to measure the speed with which you can make these stereotype congruent categorizations, right? Engineering and male would be congruent with the stereotype we might have. Family and female would be congruent with the stereotype we might have. And then we compare the speed with which you might make those set of categorizations with the speed with which you might make these ones. And you can get a sense maybe that it becomes a bit more difficult to put family words and male words in the same box and to put engineering words and female names in the same box. And again, what the task is designed to do is quantify the speed with which you can make those categorizations. Now, we've used this measure in a couple of recent samples, and I'll show you a data slide from that, but let me poll you a bit before I do. So which of the following would you expect to be true? That only men have an implicit engineering equals male bias, and women don't show this bias. That younger men, and here I'm going to be talking about data from first-year engineering students at university, that younger men have a weaker implicit engineering bias, engineering equals male bias, than do older men or men who are working as engineers. Or finally, that both men and women, and both young and older, have an implicit engineering equals male bias. Give you a chance. Okay, so the vast majority of you think that both men and women, and both younger and older, would show an implicit bias. And in fact, that's what we've been finding in some of our recent data collections. So using a version of the task that I just demoed for you, you can see that both among first-year engineering students and among professional engineers, these bars are positive. They're above 0, which would indicate no association. That means in both of our samples, we're finding people showing a much easier time putting male words and engineering words in the same box. It's a little bit weaker in women than men, but women still show a significant bias above 0. So what does this task then tell us about implicit bias? Does it actually relate to anything meaningful? First, other research, even some by my own colleagues here at UBC, have found that these biases develop quite early, sometimes in kids starting in grade school age, and in ways that can relate to their own perceptions of themselves. These types of implicit biases are also related to real-world outcomes. So I'll show you slides from a couple of different cross-national studies. I should mention that this is not the engineering equals male bias, but more of a broader science equals male bias that has been measured in samples across many different countries and found to correlate with the percent of women who major in science degree programs in those countries. So in other words, the more a country has women majoring in the sciences, the weaker the male equals science association is found to be in those countries. Similarly, in countries where a science equals male bias is stronger, the gender gap in 8th grade math scores is larger. So again, you see a country like Tunisia that has a very strong science equals male bias also has one of the largest gaps between performance in 8th grade kids. So what we get a sense even from these data, though the ones I just showed you are correlational, is that cultures have a tendency to recreate themselves. So you can have an underrepresentation of women in science and technology fields. That can then reinforce this idea that STEM equals male as a bias, even an implicit bias. And what I'll move on to tell you about is how those biases can then affect how women are seen and are treated, and how women think, feel, and act themselves. And through those processes, we can then see a subtle reinforcing of underrepresentation. And keep in mind that I'm only talking about these kind of subtle processes that are filtered through implicit biases. I'm setting aside the very real possibility that explicit bias can still exist as well. But let's talk about these pathways, and I'll start with talking about this one, how these implicit biases can affect how women are seen and treated. And there's lots of research that I could share with you about how biases can shape how women are perceived, but let me just highlight a couple of examples. First, there was a study that was done a few years ago now, but that was very revealing because I think a lot of times we like to think that biases like these are something of the past. But in this study, what the researchers did was to mail out applications for a lab technician position to faculty researchers in science disciplines across a variety of top universities. They asked them to take part in a study on how applications like this are evaluated, and faculty members made a variety of ratings. The only thing that was varied in the applications, unbeknownst to the participants, was whether the name on the top of the application was male or female. And what they found was that faculty members rated identical applicants for a research job as more competent and as more hireable when the name on the application was male rather than female. They also said they would spend more time mentoring the student if the name was male, and that they would offer a higher salary. In another example of how implicit biases can subtly kind of leak in to the hiring process, there have been several studies, including one that I was involved with, analyzing letters of recommendation written for male and female applicants. And what these studies have found is that recommendation letters written for male applicants are more often likely to include glowing adjectives and superlatives to describe the person as a standout among his or her peers, well, his peers in this case. And in fact, Dutt et al., this citation here from 2016, was one of the largest studies done, and it was research done with letters of recommendations written for applicants in the geoscientists for elite postdoc positions. And what's interesting about a lot of this research, and these two examples in particular, is these kinds of biases are often found both for men and women as evaluators. So consistent with the idea that both men and women are subject to having these biases because we're both immersed often in the same culture of underrepresentation. We're both often susceptible to having these biases play out in our perceptions of each other. And I'll talk a little bit more about what we can do to change that in a bit. I think I have a poll question here. I was just curious, I'm not sure if any of you are in the position of hiring others and evaluating letters of recommendation or of writing them for others, but I wonder how many of you maybe have ever noticed gendered language in some of the letters of recommendation that you've read, or even caught yourself writing it in yourself. So we're seeing numbers coming in, and it looks like it's hovering around 80% or so saying no, they haven't noticed it, about 17-20% saying yes, they have. It is something interesting to be mindful of if you're in the position of either writing or reviewing letters of recommendation. I can say that I was hiring someone into a position within the last week or so, and she was described as being very motherly, and she, what was the other thing? There were a couple different things that was quite noticeable to me in the way that she was being described, that very gendered language was being used, that I could easily imagine communicating the same kinds of skill sets without using more gendered words. So moving along, let me talk about this other pathway, about how these implicit biases can also affect how women think, feel, and act themselves. Because again, the idea here is that if we all have these biases, then there's also the possibility that it can leak into our own perceptions and behaviors. This often can happen through a process called stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is the idea that situations themselves, the context we're in, can bring stereotypes or can bring these implicit biases to mind in ways that can cue concerns that we might be evaluated on the basis of a devalued identity, that we might be seen through the lens of our gender. Quite a bit of this research has taken place with student samples, looking at the ways in which subtle reminders of someone's race, ethnicity, or gender can lead to underperformance on tasks where one is negatively stereotyped. So, for example, a woman having to take a difficult math test in a context that's predominantly male, where these stereotypes are brought to mind, might underperform compared to what her potential might otherwise be. To show you this in a little bit more detail, here's an example from one of the first studies documenting this phenomenon. This was a study done by Steele and Aronson at Stanford University, where they had African American and white college students come into the lab. They took a set of questions designed to measure verbal ability. But in one condition, these questions were described in that way as diagnostic of verbal ability. But for a random half of the sample, the same questions, were described as just a laboratory exercise. So nothing was ever mentioned about intelligence or ability. And with that more neutral description of what the task was meant to assess, African American students did significantly better than they did when they thought their intelligence was being assessed. And so you can see how something as subtle as how the task is framed can lead to a quite profound difference in what performance is produced. We've done something similar in looking at gender differences in math performance. So when we gave male and female college students a set of verbal quantitative problems to take, and either described it as a task where we're just looking at people's problem solving skills, or describing it as a diagnostic measure of math ability. And here we also said we were going to be comparing men to women on the test. Women did substantially better when it was described in a more neutral way than when the same questions were described as a test of ability. What a couple of decades of research on stereotype threat has taught us is that when groups experience stereotype threat, it can mask what their latent ability is and can create this kind of proverbial uneven playing field. But in this case, it's a psychologically unequal playing field. There's an extra cognitive burden that gets in the way of being fully concentrated on the task at hand. So what can we do to actually translate some of this knowledge into change for ourselves and change within our organization? So let's go back to this kind of schematic that I've been using and talk about 3 different places where we can imagine trying to intervene to break these links. The first step is being committed to fostering greater diversity in the first place. And that's part of what can be a key role into substantially changing the underrepresentation of women at this first point in the process. So what can we do to attract greater diversity in our fields or in our organization? Well, one thing is to pound the pavement, and it's important for companies and organizations to have clear metrics, clear benchmarks that they're trying to achieve. As many of you might know, Engineers Canada has the 30 by 30 initiative, where there's a stated goal to reach 30% of newly licensed professional engineers by 2030. And by stating that clear goal, one has a better idea of how to keep track of where you are and the progress that you're making. Now, in terms of trying to attract young women to domains where they haven't previously been included, often industries find that there's a need to rebrand to make these domains and careers feel like they can fit for young women, to foster a greater sense of belonging. So how do we rebrand science and technology? Some research is showing, this is research looking at computer science as a different industry, that the stereotype that women have about computer science is part of the barrier to these fields being attractive. So when you ask people, what does a computer science look like? Not surprisingly, images like this that come from popular media often come to mind. And when you remind women of this stereotype of what a computer scientist is, they're less interested in learning about computer science as a major. But when they're reminded that this is what computer science looks like, you see much more interest among women, whereas men are not so much affected by these different representations. Another example that we're seeing in some of the research coming out is that when you ask both men and women what they think about STEM industries, science and technology careers, and the degree to which those careers afford goals to help people, to help society, to make the world a better place, people don't always think of science and technology as serving those kinds of goals. But because women are more likely to state that those goals are really important to them in their careers, it's really important that science and technology careers be branded in this way, so that they can be attractive to young women as much as they are to young men. So I think I have another poll question here. I was just curious to know whether your company or organization currently engages in outreach efforts to try to attract young women into the mining sector. Okay, so it looks, again, like a fairly even split, maybe 60-40. So 60% of you are saying that your company is actively involved in some outreach, and 40% saying no. So it might be an interesting topic of discussion afterwards to share some ideas for how that might happen for those of you who aren't currently engaged in such initiatives. So moving on, let me talk about the importance of leading by example. I know often outreach efforts do involve sending women into schools to talk to kids about what it really means to have a career in mining or engineering or technology. And having these role models is really important. And it's important because it does help to change these implicit biases, both for women and for men. But focusing on women here, I can talk about the results of a study that followed women over time during their first year in university. And this study took advantage of kind of a naturalistic experiment of women who had chosen to attend a same-sex college or a co-ed college or university in the same region in the United States. And what the researchers found was that women at the same-sex college came into contact with a higher proportion of female faculty members who were in leadership positions. And that actually led to a weaker male equals leader association by the end of their first year at university. And so those implicit biases that I've been talking about were actually weakened over time. So I'm getting close to my 40-minute mark, so I'm going to move along to the second step of where we can try to intervene to combat bias. So often these biases have been ingrained over, decades of experience. So what can we really do to, if not change them, to prevent them from really affecting the way we perceive others? Well, in terms of evaluations, to the degree that hiring decisions and evaluations can be made blind to someone's gender or ethnicity or other factors that might bias perceptions, it can lead to substantive benefits for women and minorities. So for example, when orchestras in North America moved to conducting blind evaluations, the percentage of women who were chosen for the top chairs increased substantially, because evaluators were really listening only to the music that was being played and not to the person who was playing it. We also know that some efforts to combat bias are successful. So training to learn about, to recognize, and particularly to minimize implicit bias can have broader benefits in helping people set these biases aside in their evaluations of others. Now, what's important to keep in mind is that there are three key ingredients that are necessary to setting bias aside. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier in terms of these two modes of thinking, this kind of reflective system and the reflexive system. The reflexive system, that kind of autopilot, is what relies on implicit biases, but it can be set aside when the reflective system is operating. But what does it take to switch to more reflective mode? Well, it takes awareness that bias can be part of what can affect your judgment. It takes motivation to actually be on the lookout for those biases and setting them aside. And it takes time and effort when you're evaluating many evaluations, when you're conducting interviews, when you're dealing with colleagues in the workplace on a daily basis. You do have to sort of take the effort and motivation to think about ways in which biases can be set aside. But it can be done effectively. So I'll talk about a study that we currently have under review. This was a study of actual hiring decisions for men and women into elite scientific positions, where the evaluation committee, we had measures of their implicit bias, their science equals male implicit biases. And we looked at the degree to which these biases on part of committee members related to their selection of more men than women, which would be higher scores here on the y-axis. And what we found is that when committees had stronger science equals male biases, they preferred to hire more men than women, but only if they rejected discrimination as being a factor in their particular subfield. For those committees who thought that gender discrimination was cause for concern, the more they had strong implicit biases, the less likely they were to favor men over women. And in fact, you can see they were hiring at about parity, about equal numbers of men and women into these positions. So it is possible to set implicit biases aside, but it does take awareness and motivation to do so. Third, we can talk about ways to, oh, sorry, I think I had a poll back there. I was just going to ask folks whether or not your company or organization currently tries to educate employees and managers about implicit or unconscious bias, just to see how much this is already going on in your organizations. Okay, and it looks again about 40% saying yes and about 60% saying no. So again, fairly evenly split. So hopefully some interesting things you can take away from this to go back to your companies. So finally, I just want to end on talking about ways to foster gender inclusion. We've been doing some research in our own lab with women and men working in engineering companies and asking them to what degree their companies do have gender inclusive policies and practices in place. And what we've been finding is that those companies that do have gender inclusive policies, the women there report experiencing less stereotype threat. They're less conscious of their gender on a day-to-day basis. And the reason for that seems to be because their interactions with their male colleagues in particular are more supportive. So what we've been looking at is the ways in which company culture can partly be signaled by having a gender inclusive mission that's publicly known and that employees themselves are aware of, and how that might trickle down into more positive and supportive interactions between men and women. And it's funny because this is independent of the percentage of women actually at the company, which doesn't show the same predictive effects. A couple of other things to just point out. Knowledge about the processes we've been talking about here today, knowledge about implicit bias, knowledge about stereotype threat, is also something that can benefit women. It can be something that helps to put experiences of stereotype threat into context. So in testing situations, for example, when women are explicitly told that stereotypes can lead to added anxiety, it helps them frame that anxiety as something that's not reflective of their poor performance, but something that's just kind of part of this broader process of bias that helps to put things into context. And importantly, when people are aware that stereotype threat is an issue, it can also help women and minorities to react against these processes more explicitly. So for example, it's often found that women, through subtle processes, negotiate less sort of higher salaries for themselves in negotiation exercises and in actual situations. But when women are reminded that gender biases could be affecting their negotiation strategies, they counteract them successfully, they negotiate more assertively, and they do get better outcomes. So knowledge really can be power in these kinds of situations. So just to end, I just want to put a few takeaway points and then open it up for questions. What I've talked about here today is a lot of the research that's been going on in my field on implicit associations and how they're distinct from people's conscious motivations and intentions. They can affect how women are perceived, and they can undermine women's own performance. But it's important to keep in mind that that doesn't mean they can't be changed. They can be changed and they can be combated, both with education, with exposure, and with the establishment of situations that help to minimize effects. So with that, I think I'll open it up for questions, just so we have time before the end of the hour.
Well, thank you so much for that presentation, Tony. I think it was a really great blend of theory and all-important application. What do we do with all these, proven ideas? So that was great. And I'm going to give everybody a chance to type their questions into the question bar by opening up with the question that I have, which is, it's been said that the current trend to focus on unconscious bias can actually have the impact of normalizing discrimination. People realizing that, well, everybody has biases, so it's normal and I don't really have to do anything about that. How do you react to that claim and that approach?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really interesting question and an important one. I think the idea of normalizing bias is a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, we know that when people are accused of being biased, they don't usually react very well to it, right? So on the one hand, the process of normalizing bias, there's something important to that, to recognizing that it's something we share in common, that it's not something that only some people have. So my first reaction is that normalizing bias is not such a bad thing, because I think it does open people up to thinking about the role that bias is not just something that affects other people, but also can affect your own thought processes. Now, the important part, though, is to remember that just because bias might be quote unquote normal doesn't mean that it's not changeable, and doesn't mean that it's not something you have a responsibility to try to recognize and counter. And so that's why, you know, again, even on this slide that I still have up here, I hope that this distinction is really important, that, yeah, in some sense, these implicit associations are kind of a normal part of our cognitive thinking, but they can be changed. And I think to achieve the best outcomes for ourselves and for our organizations, they really should be something that we actively work to combat.
Well, thanks for that. I absolutely agree, Tony. Now let's get to questions from our audience here. We've got one from Julia. She wants to know, when looking at blind evaluations in the mining industry, how do you overcome the network effect? You know, many people rely on recommendations from their network as opposed to a formal process of applications or resumes.
Yeah, and I think that the idea of blind evaluations works really well for orchestras, and it makes the point that implicit biases can exist. In a lot of fields, it's not necessarily that feasible. You can certainly, you might be able to do it in stages. So for example, even for me, when I'm evaluating applications for something, to the degree that it's possible, I might try to look at the content without reading the person's name as the very first thing that I see. So to the degree that you can keep that information out of the process during the early screening processes, that's one way you can approach it. After that, I think you do have to switch to the process of combating bias through being aware that it could be playing a role, to having some motivation to try to set it aside, and then making sure you're taking the time to do so. I know in other types of contexts, sometimes what that might mean is for candidates who come from underrepresented groups, that you might be motivated to represent more in your company, to have a second pair of eyes, or to have a second an extra screening process to make sure there's a closer look at those applicants. Sometimes what it means is just having very clear accountability standards for keeping track. How many people of color, how many women did we have apply to this position? How many made it to the shortlist? How many made it to the interview? And sometimes, simply accounting for things over time and being conscious of it is a really important step to making a change.
I think that's a great answer. Kylie has a question here. She wants to know, how do we include men in this conversation? Why is this still seen as a women's issue?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I didn't ask the question, and I wish I would have as a poll. Maybe we could do it quickly. Just how many men and how many women are on the call here. I've given this a version of this talk to many different groups. Most recently last week to a mixed audience of men and women. In my experience, I found men very engaged in the same in the same conversation, and very interested to be a part of it. In our own research, we're really interested in the idea that the way to create change here is to bring men and women together, just like any kind of difficult problem that needs to be solved in an organization. I think we're stronger together. Diverse, going back to what I said on slide 1, diverse perspectives lead to the most creative solutions, and I wholeheartedly agree that that change will be more long-standing and sustainable if we have both men's and women's perspectives on this issue.
And to answer the question you asked, I just kind of did a quick scroll through the number of attendees that are here, and everybody. So there's about 28 people, and by kind of looking at the names, I see 2 men participating, and they're both men who are very committed and very active in inclusion efforts in the industry. And so they're also attending this webcast, and that's no surprise. So,
right.
Yeah. So the next we've got here is from Kim, and she wants to know, when a company actually provides a public comment on women on boards and they don't have diversity on their boards, is this creating an implicit bias against women?
Oh, sorry, can you say that again? I'm not sure I followed the question.
Yeah, so she says, when a company provides a public comment on women in boards, but at the same time they don't have women on their own board,
I see.
Is that creating an implicit bias against women?
Yeah, it's interesting. So it's not practicing what one preaches. Is that that's the idea? Yeah. In some of it, yeah, I don't have a clear answer to that. But because if I think about the research that's being done, it points to a couple of conflicting ideas. So I'll share them both with you, and you can sort of decide what you want to think. On the one hand, there's some research that's been published within the last 5 years or so suggesting that when companies have diversity initiatives, and again, a lot of these, in this case, a lot of this research is around more racial diversity in the US, but when companies have stated diversity initiatives, that one of the problems is that it can lead to a perception that this is a company that cares a lot about diversity. Obviously, that's kind of the idea. But it can then sometimes make it less likely that people, if an actual situation of bias or discrimination happens within the organization, that people are less likely to believe that that really is discrimination, right? There's often some kind of ambiguity around these types of contexts, and it's like, wow, this is such an inclusive company, that could really be discrimination. So there is a challenge that sort of having a stated diversity mission can seem to give a false expectation that there are never any problems. On the other hand, as I mentioned briefly, what we've been trying to do in some of our own research is to look at women and men who are working in companies, and not just the perceptions of them. And like I said, are finding that when women tell us that their companies have more diversity initiatives in place, so this is kind of akin to there's a stated mission to care about women in leadership positions, for example, that they at least report their experiences in that company being more positive. They report thinking less about gender on a day-to-day basis. They report feeling less burned out on a day-to-day basis, and they report that their interactions with their male colleagues are particularly supportive. Now, what's interesting is that we don't find that the number of women they say they have in their organization makes any difference. So it is more what the company says is important, or the policies and the practices and the mission statement that the company has is more important to predicting women's day-to-day experiences than the actual number of women there. But that's from some of my own research that takes this more psychological slant, being focused on women's own experiences. In terms of the bottom line, in terms of the productivity, for that I just don't have the same kind of information.
Thanks. And we're going to get to one more question, but I don't want anybody to log off or disappear too quickly, because I want to let you know that we are going to be issuing an invitation to everybody on the phone to learn more about Toni's research and some exciting work that she'll be leading that you may want to participate in. So don't disappear yet. Let's get to one last question. Kate wants to know, are there inherent links between gender-based microaggressions and implicit bias? How do you suggest microaggressions be addressed in transformative and constructive ways to promote culture change in STEM?
Yeah, it's the, the microaggression language, I think of them as being, in some sense, the same thing, that microaggressions often happen as the result of implicit biases. They come out of slightly different literatures, which is why the terminology is different. What can people do? It's a great question, and we don't know a ton of research on it. Obviously, you can sort of directly call people out. The problem with directly calling people out on biased behavior is, as I kind of mentioned earlier, people tend to get very defensive. So I think there is a subtlety in drawing people's attention to biases in ways that make people mindful of them, but you want to be attentive that there are real costs. The research sort of backs this up. When people call out discrimination, they are seen as complaining. Often it's easier for people to call out biases on behalf of somebody else than to call them out for themselves. It's why allies are really, really important, to be allies for each other. So I don't have a great set of tools to offer you for that. They're definitely challenging situations.
Thanks. And did you want to take this opportunity then to tell us about the engineering projects that you guys are working on?
Yes, absolutely. Let me just put up a few slides. So, right, we have created a new consortium called Engendering Success in STEM, which is going to be a 7-year project looking at ways to intervene to change the culture of implicit bias at a young age amongst kids and adolescents, amongst university students transitioning into their first career, and in working professionals. So this is a team of social scientists, STEM experts, and educational and professional partners. We currently have a full slate of partners, universities, professional associations, MIR being one of them, science education and outreach groups, nonprofit promoting organizational change, and private industry and research labs, and that's where our recruitment is really ongoing. And so, as was mentioned, if you think your company might be interested in partnering with our consortium for some of the research that we have planned over the next 7 years, please do follow up and reach out to me. I will put up kind of a last slide here, just thanking some of our other funding sources. Our research comes from SHRC. And you can learn more about our organization at the web link here. If you want to participate in a quick study to actually take a version of the implicit association test and that we can use for our research purposes, I have a link here. And there's an email as well where you can get in touch.
Well, thanks so much, Toni. We are at the end of our webcast today, so thanks everybody for attending. Thank you for your questions, and thank you so much, Toni, for taking the time to share your expertise and wealth of knowledge on this important topic with us. I want to remind everybody, let's stay connected. Recording of today's webinar will be available in the network that you can share with your colleagues who weren't available to attend today. We're going to have a blog posted shortly, so if anybody wants to continue the conversation there on a more personal note. And of course, let's continue to support information and research in this area by participating in Toni's research. You can connect with her at the email there, or you can connect with her through the network. So enjoy the rest of your Tuesday, everybody, and I hope you're able to log in at this time next month so that we can learn about mentoring immigrant professionals, which our webcast is going to be hosted with the experts from the Toronto Region Immigrant Employment Council. Thanks so much, Toni, and thank you, everyone. Have a great Tuesday.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.